Forget sound military planning. This king's greatest enemy wasn't the Greeks, it was his wristwatch. Xerxes I, the ruler of the Persian Empire, had the largest army the world had ever seen, but he couldn't wait. His impatience, his hunger for instant glory, and his refusal to listen turned what should have been an unstoppable invasion into a drawn-out disaster. This wasn't just a war lost on the battlefield, was a war lost inside the mind of a king who believed time itself would bow to him. By the time Xerxes began his invasion of Greece in 480 BCE, he had already spent years preparing for it. His father, Darius I, had tried and failed to conquer the Greeks at Marathon a decade earlier. That loss haunted the Persian court, and Xerxes wanted revenge. But more than revenge, he wanted speed. He wanted the world to see that he could succeed where his father had failed. Then that he could do it fast, the campaign became a race against pride, not a test of patience. When the invasion began, Xerxes commanded a force so massive that ancient historians struggled to count it. Herodotus claimed it was over 2 million men, though modern estimates place it closer to a few 100,000. Still, it was the largest military machine the ancient world had ever assembled soldiers. Cavalry, ships, and supply trains stretching for miles. Yet, the bigger the army grew, the slower it moved. Each day of delay meant more mouths to feed, more supplies to move, more exhaustion setting in. His advisors urged caution. They reminded him that Greece's narrow terrain and unpredictable seas could ruin any hasty plan. Xerxes didn't care. He had waited long enough. He wanted victory, and he wanted it now. Impatience became his compass. Instead of advancing with measured strategy, he pushed his army forward like a man chasing his own shadow. When engineers warned him that the crossing over the Hellespont would take time, he demanded it be done immediately. When storms destroyed the first bridge, he didn't pause to consider whether nature was warning him. He ordered the sea to be whipped literally and his workers executed. He saw the delay as an insult, not a problem to solve. To Xerxes' hesitation was weakness. But in war, patience isn't weakness, it's survival. Every general in history knows that momentum can only be sustained if it's guided by planning. Xerxes confused motion with progress. The faster he pushed, the more mistakes he made. He underestimated the terrain, misjudged his supply lines, and overestimated the loyalty of his allies. His massive army began consuming its own strength, devouring food and resources faster than they could be replenished. It was like trying to sprint across a desert with no water he could. Only go so far before the weight of his own ambition caught up to him. One of the clearest examples of his impatience came during the march through Thrace and Macedonia. The Persian army moved through territories that had already been forced into submission by earlier campaigns. The local populations were ordered to supply food, but the sheer number of Persian troops made it impossible to sustain them. Entire villages were emptied. Rivers ran dry. Horses and men alike began to die from exhaustion. Still, Xerxes refused to slow down. His commanders begged him to let the army rest and reorganize before reaching Greece proper. He brushed them off. Delay was not an option. Every step forward, no matter how costly, felt like progress to a man desperate to reach the finish line. When he finally reached Greece, that same impatience shaped his every decision. Instead of seeking long-term occupation or alliances, he aimed for immediate shock and awe. His goal was to crush Greek morale with overwhelming force to win before resistance could organize. But the Greeks were already united by necessity. They knew they couldn't match Persia in numbers, so they relied on strategy. Xerxes could have used his vast resources to outmaneuver them slowly, to wear them down with logistics and political pressure. Instead, he tried to overwhelm them outright. He wanted the kind of quick, dramatic victory that would echo through history. What he got instead was Thermopylae, a costly triumph that looked glorious but solved nothing. Imagine the mindset of a man who commands an empire stretching from India to Egypt, and yet can't stand to wait a few weeks. Xerxes believed that speed was proof of divinity. He saw patience as something for mortals, but the faster he moved, the more human his mistakes became. The Greeks turned his impatience against him. They baited him into fights that favored their terrain. They waited while he rushed. They planned while he fumed. At Thermopylae, Xerxes' impatience met its first wall literally. A narrow mountain pass, defended by a few thousand Greeks, led by 300 Spartans, stopped the mightiest army on earth. His advisors warned him that attacking directly would waste men, but Xerxes refused to retreat or wait for a better opportunity. He wanted victory today, not tomorrow. For days, wave after wave of Persian soldiers charged the Greek line, only to be cut down in the tight space where numbers meant nothing. The more they died, the angrier Xerxes became. The more he failed, the faster he wanted to succeed. His impatience blinded him to the real problem. Greece wasn't a single nation waiting to be conquered. It was a collection of fiercely independent cities, united by the threat of his invasion. Every day he spent attacking, the Greeks gained time to prepare their defenses and rally their allies. Xerxes thought speed would break them. It only gave them time to adapt. Even when he won at Thermopylae, thanks to the betrayal of a local who revealed a secret path of victory, was hollow. He had lost thousands of elite troops and gained nothing strategically. But in his mind, it was proof that his approach worked. He mistook endurance for wisdom, confusing temporary success with long-term advantage. He moved on to burn Athens, thinking the war was already over. Yet, like a gambler chasing a win, his impatience kept pushing him toward his downfall. At sea, the same flaw repeated itself. His generals warned that the Persian fleet should avoid battle until the Greeks were weakened. The Persian navy was larger but less experienced, and the narrow straits of Salamis favored smaller, more agile ships. Themistocles, the Athenian commander, knew exactly how Xerxes thought. He lured the Persian fleet into battle with false messages suggesting the Greeks were retreating. Xerxes couldn't resist the bait. He ordered an immediate attack, desperate to finish the war. But when the battle began, the crowded straits turned his size into chaos. His ships collided with each other, while the Greeks struck with precision. The Battle of Salamis destroyed most of his navy on with it. Any chance of victory, Xerxes' impatience didn't just lose him a war. It exposed his entire mindset. He saw time as an obstacle to control. He thought power meant bending the world to his will. But the world doesn't move faster just because a king demands it. His obsession with immediate results led him to ignore the basic principles of warfare: logistics, adaptation, and restraint. In his rush to prove himself greater than his father, he ensured he would be remembered for failure instead of glory. If Xerxes had taken the slower path, he had waited for winter to pass, secured his supply lines, and chosen his battles carefully, the Persian invasion might have succeeded. But patience doesn't make good propaganda. Victory delayed was, in his eyes, victory denied. And so, he traded wisdom for speed, and strategy for spectacle. What makes Xerxes' story tragic is that he lost at S that he didn't half to his army, was powerful enough to win. His empire was rich enough to sustain a long campaign. His generals were experienced enough to guide him. But none of it mattered, because the man at the top couldn't wait. His downfall began not in Greece, but in his own mind, the moment he decided that time itself was an enemy to be conquered. And that, in many ways, is what makes his failure timeless. Every leader who mistakes urgency for strength walks the same path Xerxes did. He thought greatness was measured in speed and spectacle. History proved otherwise. The greatest victories are built on patience. The greatest defeats are born from the refusal to wait. This is just the beginning of our deep dive into the hubris of a god-king Xerxes' fatal mistake. In the next part, we'll see how this same impatience led him straight into one of history's most famous military traps. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more tales of kings who thought they could outsmart time itself and learn the hard way that history always takes its time. Xerxes' impatience at Thermopylae turned what could have been a calculated, overwhelming victory into one of the most embarrassing strategic blunders in ancient warfare. The King of Kings, with the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen, stood before a narrow mountain pass, defended by only a few hundred Spartans and their allies. To any rational commander, the situation demanded patience and caution. Xerxes had the advantage in every measurable way: men, ships, resources, and time. Yet he refused to wait. He could not tolerate the idea that a handful of defiant Greeks dared to delay the march of his empire. That impatience became his undoing. When Xerxes arrived at Thermopylae, he believed the small Greek force guarding the pass would scatter at the first sight of his army. His scouts had reported that only a few thousand men stood between him and the heart of Greece. For a ruler accustomed to crushing nations and burning cities, this was an insult. He had crossed the Hellespont with an army so vast it shook the earth beneath its feet. The Persian engineers had built floating bridges, filled rivers, and carved roads across mountains for his passage. To be stopped by a narrow strip of land and a few stubborn warriors was intolerable. His advisors urged patience. The Persian navy could have landed troops behind the pass to surround the Greeks or block their retreat. His engineers could have found alternate routes through the rugged terrain. He could have simply waited. The Greeks had limited supplies and would eventually have been forced to withdraw or starve. But Xerxes would hear none of it. He saw delay as humiliation. Every hour he spent waiting was, to him, an insult to his divine authority. So, he did what arrogant kings often do when faced with defiance. He ordered an immediate attack. He sent wave after wave of Persian infantry into the narrow pass, expecting his men to break through by sheer weight of numbers. But Thermopylae was not a battlefield suited to mass warfare. It was a funnel-tight, rocky, and unforgiving. The Persian army's size, which had been its greatest strength in open terrain, became a curse in this confined space. The Spartans had chosen the ground perfectly. The pass was so narrow that only a few men could fight side by side. The Persian formations designed for wide plains and open charges were useless here. The Greeks, protected by heavy bronze armor and massive shields, fought in disciplined ranks, each man covering the other. Their phalanx moved as one solid wall of iron and muscle. When the Persians charged, they were met with a barrier that simply did not move. Imagine the chaos of those first assaults. Thousands of Persian soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder, their numbers meaningless, trying to push through a bottleneck of stone. The front ranks were crushed against the Greek shields, while the ranks behind them pressed forward, unable to see or maneuver. Spears shattered, arrows fell harmlessly against Greek armor, and the screams of the wounded echoed off the cliffs. Every inch of ground became soaked in blood, but the line held. By midday, the Persian soldiers were exhausted. They had attacked in waves, each group expecting to finish what the previous had failed to do. But the result was always the same death and confusion. The Spartans rotated their men efficiently, allowing fresh warriors to replace the tired ones. Their discipline was unmatched. Even under relentless attack, they maintained formation, their movements precise and deliberate. Xerxes, watching from his command post, grew furious. He could not understand how his elite soldiersmen, trained and equipped to conquer entire nations, could not crush a few hundred defenders. He blamed cowardice, poor coordination, anything but his own decision to force the issue. When the Medes and Scythians failed, he sent in the Immortals, his personal guard of 10,000 elite warriors. To Xerxes, they were the embodiment of perfection invincible, tireless, and loyal beyond question. But even they could not overcome geography and discipline. The Immortals charged again and again, only to be repelled by the same narrow choke point. Their ornate armor offered little protection against the thrusting Greek spears, and their lighter shields shattered under the weight of bronze. As the bodies piled up, the pass became a killing ground. The Persians lost not just men, but morale. Soldiers began to hesitate, their confidence eroded by the sheer futility of their efforts. Word spread through the ranks that the Spartans were not ordinary men, that they laughed in the face of death, that they fought like demons. Xerxes' grand army, which had once seemed unstoppable, was now stalled by a handful of warriors who refused to move. Xerxes' impatience wasn't only tactical, it was emotional. He could not accept that war was as much about restraint as aggression. Every moment of hesitation felt like a personal attack on his pride. His empire had been built on the belief that no one could resist Persian might. So when resistance appeared, he reacted with rage instead of reason. That rashness blinded him to opportunity. Had Xerxes taken a step back to consider his options, the battle might have unfolded very differently. His fleet could have landed troops behind Thermopylae, forcing the Greeks to retreat without ever fighting. His engineers could have scouted the surrounding mountains for alternate paths sooner. He could have used his numerical advantage to cut off supplies and trap the defenders until hunger forced them to surrender. Instead, he wasted men and morale on fruitless assaults that accomplished nothing. Even when he finally discovered the mountain path that allowed his forces to flank the Greeks, thanks to the betrayal of a local named Impatience, it was too late to salvage the strategic damage already done. His troops were weary, his officers frustrated, and his enemies emboldened. The Greek resistance at Thermopylae became a rallying cry across the land. Xerxes had intended to terrify Greece into submission. Instead, he inspired them to unity. The cost of his impatience went beyond the battlefield. The days he lost at Thermopylae drained his supplies and delayed his advance into central Greece. Every army of that size required constant feeding, coordination, and control. The longer it lingered in hostile territory, the more it strained its supply lines. Disease and hunger began to spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had once marched proudly under the banner of the great king now whispered doubts in their tents at night. This is where Xerxes' flaw as a ruler bled into his role as a general. He ruled through fear and expectation of absolute obedience. His subjects built his image as a near-divine being, incapable of error. That made it impossible for anyone around him to question his decisions. His officers knew the frontal assaults at Thermopylae were suicidal, but none dared challenge him. In the Persian court, disagreement was dangerous. So, they watched silently as thousands died to feed their king's impatience. The irony is that Xerxes had every possible advantage. His engineers had demonstrated brilliance in bridging the Hellespont. His army had marched with organization and grandeur. His navy had secured his supply lines. Yet in that narrow mountain pass, all his power meant nothing because he could not master himself. The greatest obstacle he faced was not the Greek phalanx, it was his own ego. Thermopylae became a lesson in how arrogance distorts strategy. A wise commander adapts to the battlefield. An arrogant one forces the battlefield to adapt to him. Xerxes did the latter, and it cost him thousands of lives and the momentum of his campaign. What should have been a swift conquest turned into a prolonged and costly war that exposed every weakness of his vast empire. As the smoke cleared and the last of the Spartans fell, Xerxes may have thought he had finally achieved victory. But the truth was the opposite. His impatience had already doomed him. The blood he spilled at Thermopylae bought him nothing but time lost and morale shattered. From that point forward, every step he took into Greece was on the back of a hollow triumph, one that revealed not his power, but the limits of it. By the time Xerxes reached the waters of Salamis, his entire campaign had turned into a race against his own pride. He had already burned Athens, watched his army strain under the weight of supply shortages, and suffered the loss of countless soldiers at Thermopylae. Yet none of that humbled him. He still believed speed was strength and hesitation was defeat. So when his generals urged patience before engaging the Greek fleet, Xerxes' temper flared. To him, waiting meant weakness, and weakness was the one thing a god king could never show. The Persian fleet was the most powerful the ancient world had ever seen. Hundreds of ships from conquered lands lined up under Xerxes' command. Phoenician triremes, Egyptian warships, and Ionian vessels all assembled into a vast floating empire. To anyone else, it would have looked unbeatable. But to those who understood naval warfare, size wasn't everything. The narrow straits between Salamis Island and the Greek mainland were a trap waiting to be sprung. In such tight waters, numbers became a curse, not an advantage. Xerxes' commanders knew this. They had studied the terrain, the winds, and the tides. They pleaded with the king to wait for the Greeks to make a mistake. They begged him to lure the enemy into open sea, where the Persian numbers could finally matter. Xerxes didn't listen. Themistocles, the Athenian commander, understood his enemy's mind better than anyone. He knew Xerxes couldn't resist the temptation of a decisive, dramatic victory. So Themistocles crafted a deception worthy of a stage play. He sent a secret message to Xerxes claiming that the Greeks were about to retreat during the night. If Xerxes wanted to crush them, the message said he needed to act fast. For any rational commander, it would have smelled like a trap. But Xerxes was not a rational commander. He was a proud ruler, desperate for a win. He didn't stop to ask if it made sense. He didn't even question how the Greeks could retreat when their cities were already destroyed. The thought that his enemies might be manipulating him never crossed his mind. He ordered his navy to prepare for battle at dawn. No rest, no scouting, no careful formation, just attack. The generals who hesitated were silenced, some even punished. He wanted the world to see his glory from the shore. He even built a golden throne on a hill overlooking the water so he could watch what he expected to be the final triumph of the Persian Empire. At sunrise, the sea was calm, but the tension was heavy. The Persian fleet moved in, their oars cutting through the water in perfect rhythm. On paper, it looked like an unstoppable force, but as the ships entered the straits, the cracks began to show. The space grew tighter with every meter. The wind shifted, the current tugged at the ships. The once perfect lines began to twist and collide. Captains shouted orders over the chaos, but their voices were drowned by the sound of wood slamming against wood. Then, like ghosts emerging from the mist, the Greek ships appeared. Themistocles had been waiting. His smaller, lighter triremes sliced through the Persian front lines with surgical precision. The Persians tried to maneuver, but there was nowhere to go. Their ships were packed so tightly that when one turned, it crashed into another. The Greeks, meanwhile, moved with purpose. They rammed, reversed, and struck again. Their oarsmen were locals who knew these waters like the backs of their hands. The Persians, many of whom were sailors from far-off coasts, couldn't adapt. From his golden throne, Xerxes watched in disbelief as his glorious fleet disintegrated before his eyes. What was supposed to be a display of unstoppable power turned into a floating graveyard. Ships caught fire, soldiers drowned. The sound of splintering hulls echoed across the straits. At first, Xerxes thought it was just bad luck. Then, as the losses piled up, he realized the truth. He had walked right into a trap. But even then, he couldn't admit fault. His pride wouldn't let him. When his commanders tried to regroup, he blamed them. When the sailors panicked, he called them cowards. What he couldn't see was that the real cowardice was his own refusal to wait, to think, to lead with anything other than emotion. He had confused rage for resolve. The Battle of Salamis wasn't just a defeat, it was a turning point. The Persian fleet was crippled beyond repair. Without naval support, Xerxes' massive land army became stranded in hostile territory. Supply lines, which had already been stretched thin, were now cut off. The Greeks, once thought to be hopelessly outmatched, suddenly held the upper hand. They controlled the sea, and with it, the future of the war. Historians often describe Salamis as one of the most brilliant examples of strategy defeating strength. It wasn't the Greeks' size, resources, or even their weapons that won the day. It was their patience. Themistocles understood something Xerxes never did, that in war, the best trap is the one your enemy builds for himself. Xerxes' impatience did all the work for him. Let's pause and imagine the moment after the battle. The air thick with smoke, the water littered with wreckage, and Xerxes, once surrounded by thousands of cheering men, now watching in silence as the sea swallowed his fleet. The man who thought himself a god had just learned a lesson every mortal knows: no one, not even a king, can rush victory. Back in the Persian camp, confusion turned to fear. The soldiers knew what this meant. Without ships, they couldn't receive supplies from Asia. Without supplies, they couldn't sustain the war. The invasion that had started with thunder now began to crumble under its own weight. But Xerxes still couldn't face the truth. He believed that if he kept moving, kept attacking, he could somehow undo the disaster. Instead of retreating to preserve what was left, he hesitated, caught between his ego and his fear of appearing weak. That hesitation cost him even more. His advisors argued over what to do next. Some wanted to withdraw to Asia immediately to protect the empire. Others wanted to fortify in northern Greece and try again. Xerxes ignored both sides, unsure which mistake would look less like failure. The irony was cruel. The man who had once been destroyed by acting too fast was now paralyzed by the thought of acting at all. But the damage was done. His massive fleet, the pride of Persia, was gone. The power that had once terrified the Mediterranean now lay in pieces on the shore. The Greeks, emboldened by their victory, pursued the Persians relentlessly, knowing the once mighty invaders were vulnerable and disorganized. Xerxes' impatience had handed them the momentum they needed to turn defense into offense. What makes this moment so fascinating is that Xerxes didn't lose because he lacked strength or resources. He lost because he refused to trust anyone but himself. His generals saw the trap. His allies warned him. Even nature gave him signs: shifting winds, narrow waters, restless tides, all urging him to wait. But to Xerxes, waiting was losing, and that belief became his undoing. Every mistake he made at Salamis came from the same source: arrogance disguised as confidence. He believed his will could rewrite reality, that numbers could overcome nature, that impatience could replace planning. It's the same fatal thinking that has destroyed countless leaders across history. The belief that speed equals power. The Battle of Salamis became more than a naval disaster. It became a symbol of hubris, punished by nature itself. Xerxes' fleet, trapped in a strait too small for its size, mirrored the king's own mind. grand, ambitious, but too rigid to adapt. The more he pushed, the more it collapsed. And yet, even after this catastrophic loss, he still believed he could win. He left part of his army behind under General Mardonius to continue the campaign while he fled back to Asia, pretending it was a strategic withdrawal. In truth, it was an escape. His dream of conquering Greece had sunk with his fleet. If Xerxes had waited just one more day, if he had listened to his commanders, if he had trusted the experience of his sailors instead of the noise in his own head, the outcome might have been very different. But that was never his nature. To Xerxes, victory wasn't something earned, it was something demanded. And when the universe refused to obey, his empire paid the price. The arrogant rush to naval battle was the moment when Xerxes' campaign stopped being about conquest and became about survival. From here, everything unraveled: the army's morale, the empire's reputation, and the illusion of Persian invincibility. In the next part, we'll see what happened after this humiliating defeat, how Xerxes' impatience not only cost him a navy, but his entire dream of ruling the West. If you're enjoying this breakdown of one of history's greatest royal blunders, make sure to like the video. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more stories about how ego, impatience, and arrogance built the dumbest mistakes in history. Xerxes' decision to trust Ephialtes, a local trader, for a shortcut around Thermopylae marked one of the most reckless and short-sighted moments of his entire invasion. It was a decision born not from careful strategy or reconnaissance, but from sheer impatience, a desperate attempt to break the deadlock that his arrogance had created. For days, the Persian army had thrown itself at the narrow pass, losing thousands of men against a mere few hundred Greeks who refused to yield. Each failed assault deepened Xerxes' frustration and wounded his pride. When Ephialtes appeared, whispering of a secret mountain path that would outflank the Spartans, Xerxes saw not a risk but an opportunity to finally crush the defiance that mocked him. In the Persian camp, this was seen as divine providence. A god, they said, had delivered them the key to victory. But to anyone with military sense, it was a dangerous gamble. Ephialtes was a local, a man of no rank or proven loyalty, motivated only by greed and self-preservation. His offer came not out of allegiance to Persia, but out of selfishness. He wanted gold and the safety that might come from siding with the invaders. Xerxes knew this. He was no fool when it came to human ambition. But his growing impatience had clouded his judgment. He did not take time to verify Ephialtes' claims or to send scouts ahead to confirm the route. He wanted immediate results, and he believed that his overwhelming force could handle any uncertainty. This was the mindset that had already cost him at Thermopylae, the belief that power could replace strategy, that numbers could replace knowledge. So, he accepted Ephialtes' offer without hesitation. The man led the way, and Xerxes chose to send his most elite unit, the Immortals, along this unverified route. These were not ordinary soldiers. The Immortals were the pride of Persia, 10,000 hand-picked warriors who represented the finest discipline and skill in the empire. To commit them to an unfamiliar mountain path under the guidance of a single trader was a reckless use of elite manpower. The trail Ephialtes revealed wound through the mountains of Kalidramis, a narrow and treacherous route known only to the locals. The Greeks were aware of this path, and they had stationed a small contingent of Phocians there to guard it. Xerxes' own intelligence officers had surely heard rumors of its existence, yet he had dismissed any need to explore it earlier. In his arrogance, he had assumed the frontal assault would be enough. Only when desperation set in did he suddenly decide to trust a stranger to deliver him from the consequences of his own poor strategy. The march through the mountain path began at night. The Immortals moved silently, torches dimmed, relying on Ephialtes' guidance. For hours, they climbed in single file through dense forests and rocky passes. The soldiers were uneasy. They were elite, but even they knew the risks of moving in unfamiliar terrain, especially without scouting or mapping. Yet in the Persian army, questioning orders was unthinkable. The great king's word was absolute. Xerxes had decreed that this was the path to victory, and so it must be. When dawn began to break, the Immortals emerged behind the Greek lines. The Phocians guarding the trail were startled. They had been caught completely off guard. In the confusion, they retreated up the mountain to take a defensive position, mistakenly thinking the Persians meant to attack them directly. This left the path open for the Immortals to descend upon the Spartan rear. Ephialtes had delivered exactly what he promised: a way to surround the Greeks. On the surface, it looked like a stroke of genius. Xerxes had finally found his way around the bottleneck that had cost him so many lives. But beneath that apparent success lay a deeper failure of understanding. By relying on a single informant and acting out of impatience, Xerxes revealed how fragile his command truly was. He had turned to treachery not as a tool of strategy, but as a shortcut to avoid the hard discipline of waiting and thinking. His entire decision was reactive, not planned. He had not outsmarted Leonidas, had stumbled upon luck handed to him by a cowardly opportunist. This reliance on a traitor also carried long-term consequences that Xerxes could not see in the moment. The betrayal of Thermopylae became one of the most infamous acts in Greek history. Ephialtes' name would forever be synonymous with treachery. For Xerxes, this victory, if it could even be called that, did not command respect. It did not terrify the Greek world into submission. Instead, it emboldened them. The fact that Persia had needed betrayal to defeat 300 Spartans only magnified their heroism. The Greeks came to see Thermopylae not as a defeat, but as a symbol of unbreakable resistance. Strategically, Xerxes' decision also showed his lack of trust in his own officers. Among his generals were men with years of experience in mountain warfare, logistics, and intelligence. They would have known the danger of relying on a single unverified source. But Xerxes' court was not one where advice was freely given or safely heard. His position as divine monarch meant that to question his judgment was to question the will of the gods. So even if his generals had doubts about Ephialtes, none dared to voice them. The result was a command structure built on silence and fear, a fatal flaw that would echo throughout the campaign. Consider for a moment how a more disciplined commander might have handled the same situation. A cautious general would have detained Ephialtes, verified his claims with local scouts, and mapped the route before committing troops. He might have used smaller units first to test the path, or coordinated a simultaneous diversionary attack to ensure success. Xerxes did none of these things. His thinking was simple: immediate movement, immediate results. His pride could not bear another day of Spartan defiance. That impatience revealed another weakness: his misunderstanding of morale. By the time Ephialtes appeared, the Persian soldiers were weary, demoralized by the endless, fruitless assaults. Their faith in Xerxes' leadership had already begun to erode. The decision to rely on a traitor to win the battle sent a dangerous message that even the great king needed deceit to achieve victory. Among the ranks, whispers spread that the gods favored the Greeks, that only betrayal could break their line. The psychological damage of that perception would linger long after Thermopylae fell. And when the immortals finally completed the encirclement and the Spartans were surrounded, the victory felt hollow. The Persians had won not through superior tactics or courage, but through treachery. The Greeks fought to the last man, dying on their own terms. Xerxes, standing on the field afterward, must have sensed that emptiness. He had won the ground, but lost the narrative. His empire had proven powerful, but not invincible, capable of crushing bodies, but not breaking spirit. Ephialtes, the man who had made this possible, received his payment and his fleeting moment of favor. But even Xerxes must have known what kind of man he was dealing with. A traitor once is a traitor always. If Ephialtes could betray his own people for gold, what loyalty could he possibly have to Persia? Xerxes' decision to trust such a man reflected not strategic brilliance, but desperation. In war, the measure of a commander is not how quickly he seizes opportunity, but how well he judges risk. By that standard, Xerxes failed completely. This episode at Thermopylae exposed the core flaw in the Persian invasion. The campaign was built on spectacle and momentum rather than strategy and patience. Xerxes believed that because he was the king of kings, the world would bend to his will. But in the narrow pass of Thermopylae, surrounded by mountains and defiance, he learned that even kings are bound by the limits of reason and caution. His trust in Ephialtes was not an act of intelligence, it was a symptom of his blindness. The kind of blindness that dooms empires when pride replaces discipline. So while history remembers that the Persians finally broke through, it also remembers how they did it by relying on the word of a coward, guided by a king too impatient to think. And in that, Xerxes' shortcut became more than just a tactical decision. It became a symbol of how arrogance and haste can turn even the greatest army in the world into little more than pawns led by pride toward inevitable ruin. By the end of the campaign, Xerxes' empire was no longer marching forward, it was limping home. The same impatience that had driven him to attack too soon now left him incapable of building anything that could last. What began as the greatest military expedition in human history ended as a slow collapse. A failure not just of tactics, but of vision. Xerxes wanted instant glory, not sustainable conquest, and that choice destroyed everything he had built. The truth is that no empire wins a war of distance and terrain without a plan for endurance. Greece was hundreds of miles from Persia's heartlands. Every soldier, every horse, and every crate of grain had to be carried across mountains, deserts, and seas. The success of such a campaign depended entirely on logistics, on maintaining food, supplies, morale, and reinforcements across months of fighting. But Xerxes never cared for the dull work of sustaining a war. He wanted spectacle. He wanted the kind of victory that would echo across the world before the year's end. That obsession meant his entire invasion was front-loaded. He poured enormous resources into the opening phases, crossing the Hellespont, building bridges, amassing ships, but gave almost no thought to what would happen once he was inside Greece. He assumed the Greeks would collapse in fear as soon as his army appeared. He assumed the cities would surrender one by one. He assumed, above all, that the war would be quick. Every decision he made was built on that fantasy. When the Battle of Salamis shattered his fleet, that fantasy fell apart instantly. The loss of his navy didn't just mean defeat at Sit, cut off his supply lines. His army on land suddenly had no reliable way to receive food, reinforcements, or communication from Asia. The entire Persian war effort was now stranded in enemy territory, vulnerable and starving. Xerxes, the self-proclaimed God King, found himself facing the most human problem of all: hunger. His commanders saw the writing on the wall. The brilliant general, Mardonius, urged him to retreat while he still could. The empire's best troops had already suffered enormous casualties, and morale was crumbling. But Xerxes couldn't accept the reality of failure. For days, he hesitated, torn between his pride and his survival. Then, when the risk became too great, he abandoned the campaign altogether. He left Mardonius in charge of the remaining forces and sailed back to Asia with what was left of his personal guard. It was a retreat disguised as strategic withdrawal, but everyone knew the truth. The King of Kings had fled the battlefield. Mardonius, loyal but realistic, tried to salvage what he could. He reorganized the army and prepared for another push the following year, but he was fighting an impossible battle. Without naval support, the Persian army was isolated. Every Greek village became a potential enemy stronghold, every mountain pass a trap. Supplies dwindled, disease spread. The soldiers who had once marched in perfect rows now scrounged for food in abandoned towns. The once invincible army that had shaken Asia now struggled just to stay alive. At Plataea, in 479 BCE, Mardonius made one final stand. The Persians still outnumbered the Greeks, but their discipline was gone. They were exhausted, hungry, and fighting far from home. The Greeks, meanwhile, were defending their land. They had learned from every previous battle, from Marathon to Salamis. They knew the Persians' weaknesses. The result was predictable. Mardonius fell in battle, and the Persian army collapsed in panic. Thousands were cut down as they tried to flee. What had begun as a grand invasion ended as a scattered, broken retreat. For Xerxes, it was the ultimate humiliation. The empire that once seemed unstoppable had failed to conquer a small, divided peninsula. The war had drained Persia's treasury, cost the lives of countless soldiers, and achieved nothing. All he had to show for it were ashes and regret. But even then, his pride wouldn't allow him to admit defeat. He returned to his palace in Susa and built monuments, not to his failure, but to his supposed greatness. He surrounded himself with luxury and flattery, pretending that the campaign had been a partial success. History, however, remembered the truth. What makes Xerxes' downfall so telling is how preventable it was. He had the resources to fight a long war. He had the manpower, the ships, the engineers, and the wealth. What he didn't have was patience. He didn't understand that empires aren't built on one grand strike, they rebuilt on endurance. The Greeks didn't win because they were richer or stronger. They won because they knew how to last. They planned for every outcome, rationed their supplies, and fought only when conditions favored them. Xerxes, on the other hand, believed his empire's size could defy time, distance, and exhaustion. He thought war was a sprint when it was really a marathon. His failure revealed a deeper truth about leadership. Power without discipline is just noise. Xerxes could command armies, build bridges, and order cities to burn, but he couldn't command himself. He couldn't wait, listen, or learn. The very traits that made him appear powerful, his confidence, his speed, his certainty, were the same ones that destroyed him. Every major loss, from Thermopylae to Salamis to Plataea, can be traced back to the same flaw: impatience. Consider the contrast. Themistocles, his Greek rival, didn't have half his resources, but he had patience. He waited, he planned, he understood his enemy's mind. He knew Xerxes would act rashly, and he built his entire strategy around that flaw. When Themistocles sent that false message before Salamis, he didn't just outsmart a king, he outweighted him. That patience changed the course of history. After Xerxes' retreat, Persia never again tried to conquer mainland Greece. The dream of turning the Aegean into a Persian lake was dead. The empire shifted its focus eastward, expanding into safer, more profitable territories. But its image of invincibility was gone forever. The Greeks, inspired by their victories, began to see themselves as the defenders of civilization. Decades later, Alexander the Great would flip the script entirely, invading Persia and dismantling the very empire Xerxes had once ruled. In that sense, Xerxes' impatience didn't just lose him a war, it changed the trajectory of world history. If he had succeeded, the cultural heart of the Western world might have spoken Persian, not Greek. Philosophy, democracy, and science as we know them might have taken a very different path. But his failure preserved the independence of Greece, allowing it to flourish and eventually shape the world that followed. It's ironic, Xerxes thought he was fighting for eternal glory. In the end, the only thing eternal about his campaign was the lesson it left behind. Every empire that followed from Rome to Napoleon to modern superpowers has faced the same test: the ability to wage not just war, but sustainable war, the kind that can last through seasons, setbacks, and shifting tides. Xerxes failed that test spectacularly. His story remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing power with endurance. Greatness isn't about striking fast, it's about lasting long. The Persians could crush cities in days, but couldn't hold them for years. The Greeks, though small, understood how to endure. In war, patience is strategy. Xerxes never learned that, and his empire paid the price. Even centuries later, historians still look at his invasion as the textbook example of how ego destroys strategy. The biggest army in the world, the grandest ships, the richest empire, none of it mattered when led by a man who couldn't wait to win. His impatience burned through his resources like a wildfire. When the flames died down, there was nothing left to build on. And that's the legacy of Xerxes' war. It wasn't a failure of courage or resources, it was a failure of patience. His empire survived, but his reputation did not. He became the king who couldn't finish what he started. His story stands as a warning that no amount of wealth or power can make up for the absence of discipline and time. If Xerxes had chosen the long road, if he had slowed down, fortified his positions, and built a campaign meant to last, history might remember him as the conqueror of Greece. Instead, we remember him as the impatient god-king who tried to rush destiny. And that's where our story ends. From the world's largest army to the narrow straits of Salamis, from arrogance to collapse, Xerxes' downfall shows what happens when a ruler wages war against patience itself. His empire could conquer nations, but not time. His ambition built bridges over seas, but none across wisdom. So the next time someone tells you that success is about speed, remember Xerxes the king who moved too fast and fell too hard. If you enjoyed this story and want more tales of history's biggest blunders, don't forget to like the video. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we explore the moments when pride, impatience, and pure human error reshaped the world forever.